All right. I am now fortunate to be able to introduce our speakers for the evening. We have speakers who will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion, questions, anything that you would like to bring up. So I am pulling up my information on that. Our topic is racism and reparative justice, acknowledging our past and reshaping our future. I'm very happy to introduce you to our speakers, Dr. Geoff Ward and Cecilia Wright from Washington University. They will explain the concept of reparative remembrance and then explain their work in a variety of projects and organizations that have to do with the topic of reparative justice and addressing the histories and legacies of racial violence, which are critical to reshaping our collective future. So with that, I will introduce you, and we have a third guest, and please remind me of your name.
Oh, Molly Schneider.
Molly Schneider is also here. She is a graduate student doing her dissertation at Washington University in sociology. And so we have three experts here to discuss these topics. Without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Geoff.
Thank you, Liz, and hello, everyone. Let me see if I can move this back here a little bit. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight, and I want to thank you for the invitation, and also thank you all for the work you do in our community to advance social justice. I promised my colleagues I would not actually ask them to speak. I'm not sure I'm going to stick to that, but we'll see how things go. But I wanted them to come with me because we're working together on projects I'm going to be talking about. And I also wanted to use the invitation we received to the Reparative Justice Coalition to speak, where I raised my hand and said, I'll do it. I wanted to use it also as an opportunity to introduce them to this group in anticipation of the ways they might want to engage with you in the future. So that's partly why they're with us tonight. So thank you, Cecilia and Molly, for joining us. So my name is Geoff Ward. I'm a professor of African and African American Studies at WashU, and I'm director of the WashU Slavery Project, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight as an example of reparative community remembrance happening in St. Louis right now. I'm an historical sociologist, and basically what that means is I'm interested in the relationship between the past and the present, or how the past works as a social force. And and what we do about that. And so I'm laughing because I just got an email today that referred to one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight, which is the removal of the St. Louis County historical marker, which I've been agitating around since I got to St. Louis in 2018, and the county finally removed it. But I got an email today from the Brown School of Social Work at WashU that said I've been named a Black History Month champion, and I was added to a wall of champions. And I was telling my kids before I came here tonight, I was telling them I'm in the Hall of Fame now, and they're like, "Well, what did you do?" And I was like, "Well," so I read them the story, and the description said, you know, he does all these different things. And recently he successfully, what did he say? He said something like he successfully mobilized to remove, quote, historical debris in the city of Clayton. You know, And I just, it's funny, they use that language because I used that terminology in a recent media story about the sign, historical debris. I just thought it was hilarious that was like the way they reduced the whole thing down to, and it got me in the Hall of Fame, which is great. But let me say a little bit about, this idea of reparative remembrance and why why I'm energized around these issues that we're going to talk about tonight, including historical markers that I know most people don't read, didn't know it was there anyway. I'm sure people heard about, like, if you read the Riverfront Times story about it, there's comments below it, like, what's wrong with this guy, Ward? Doesn't he have more important things to worry about than historical markers and so forth? And the reason, though, the reason I think these issues matter, and what motivates me to work with groups like the Reparative Justice Coalition, members of which are here, and to organize the WashU Slavery Project and Memory for the Future, I'm going to talk about, is because we know from the social science research evidence that I've been involved in, I've been involved in studying legacies of racial violence now for over a decade. We know that communities marked by histories of racialized violence continue to be affected by those histories in the form of contemporary patterns of conflict and violence and inequality. One of the relationships that's been demonstrated over and over again now is the relationship between, just to give you an example of this, between the history of lynching in our country and contemporary homicide rates. And that's one of the reasons I noticed that St. Louis County historical marker when I first got to Clayton and St. Louis in 2018, and we live in Clayton, so we spend a lot of time in that area. And I thought, well, this is crazy. There's a memorial, there's a monument to white settler colonialism, and it's right outside the county police headquarters. And so immediately I thought, well, this is a ridiculous degradation of the right to equal protection under law. This is a sign that says white lives especially matter here. And we remember their arrival. We mark the date of their arrival. We identify our county in relation to the presence of white colonists, was the specific language to use to describe. It was a really, but I knew from this social science research evidence, which is what really led me to move to St. Louis. I knew this would be a really ideal place to pursue not only the research, but also the translation of the research evidence. What do we do with this information? I knew that the Mississippi River Valley, generally speaking, in the state of Missouri, freedom's compromised state. And the city of St. Louis, which has been energized by the movement for Black Lives and other contemporary struggles. I knew this would be an ideal place to sort of begin to move away from the basic research I'd been doing on these issues for many years and focus more on the question of redress. What do we do with this information? And it's in that context that I became really interested in this idea of reparative memory work, or reparative, community remembrance as a strategy of intervention. We were in our class, Cecilia is in a class with me this semester, and we were talking this morning about memory issues, which, my wife and I are now not middle-aged. We have memory issues, and we were talking about societal memory issues. Our legislature has memory issues. There are things that they refuse to know. They want to forget without having known them. Like how we've been impacted by histories of colonialism and its various offshoots, including slavery and racialized violence. Another thing that motivated me with regard to that marker and some of the other things I've been working on, I'm going to share with you, is one of the most encouraging findings in this body of research I've been talking about this research shows, just to give you a little more sense of what it involves, study after study these are sophisticated statistical analyses of how histories of things like enslavement at the county level, the percent of the population enslaved historically, or the lynching rate in the county historically. Study after study has shown that contemporary outcomes, like I mentioned homicide, also infant mortality rates, patterns of racial disparity in heart disease, white supremacist mobilization, white conservatism generally, the use of capital punishment, incarceration rates, police violence, voter suppression. Our most recent study looked at the contemporary use of corporal punishment in schools, which remains legal in 19 states, is not practiced in most states routinely, but we showed in this study that every lynching in the history of a county increases the odds that a child will be corporally punished. For African-American kids, the increase was 6% per lynching in the history of the county. The odds that you would be corporally punished in a contemporary school in one of these 11 states we looked at went up 6% if you were African-American, particularly younger kids in a county with a pronounced history of lynching. The effect was also observed for white kids in these counties. These are places where, these are just some of the studies I'm mentioning that show us that essentially society embodies and reproduces historical racialized violence over generations. We embody it and reproduce it in different forms. It manifests in various ways, and the chains are complicated. How does lynching relate to contemporary homicide? We could talk about that more if you like. But one of the most encouraging studies recently showed that in counties where white residents actively disavowed white supremacism, the relationship between lynching and homicide was weaker. Now that's an encouraging indication that a place can essentially change course, disembody, to some extent at least, the haunting legacy of historical racial violence. That study measured disavowal of white supremacy in a very specific way, narrow way, which was the extent to which white voters supported candidates who ran for office on white supremacist kinds of platforms. And they weren't looking at the contemporary elections, although they could. Unfortunately, there are contemporary candidates who run on explicitly and implicitly racist platforms. They were looking at whether voters, the rate at which voters supported Strom Thurmond and George Wallace in their presidential campaigns in the 20th century, after lynching had declined. And they found that in places where white voters turned away from those messages, those agendas, the effect of lynching on homicide was weaker than in counties that also had histories of lynching, but where white voters essentially re-upped, with the agenda of segregation and white dominance and so forth. So that led me to think, this study came out a few years ago, and I thought, well, if voter behavior, if this measure of voter behavior shows this effect, what other kinds of disavowal might be meaningful? And one example that came to mind for me was intervention in the commemorative landscape. Disavowal of Confederate monuments, for example, and removing county markers that celebrate white settler colonialism. And this is why in my conversations with the county government and in afterward, I stressed that not only should the marker be removed or revised, but it's critical that we do that publicly. It's critical that the county leadership say to the people, we're doing this because it's inconsistent with our values. We disavow the sentiment that is expressed in this marker. That's not what the county chose to do. The county chose, and I got an email from a Clayton official who was, the city of Clayton government, I have to say, has been very supportive of this effort. The equity commission that the mayor set up, expressed great support immediately when I submitted my original letter of complaint to that commission. but they didn't own this, they didn't own the land that the sign was on, and they were hesitant to push too hard on the county without taking stock first of the city of Clayton's commemorative landscape. And that's why the mayor set up a task force, and then she invited me to be a part of that. And so years went on, a couple years went by, and county didn't do anything. And then I got an email from a Clayton city councilor who said, just by the way, I heard that now that the November election is over, this was back in like late November, the marker is finally going to come down. And I said, oh, isn't that interesting? And I said, will there be some public acknowledgement, some statement of principles that are leading to this action? And she said, I'm glad you reminded me of that. I'm going to bring it back to the, bring it back to our body, and we're going to talk about it. But no, it was removed, middle of the night, where somebody had a camera. There's probably some cameras, some camera footage at Starbucks or something. We could kind of do an expose. But that's also why I reached out to media outlets and said, be good to write a story about this, because we need as a community to process this if we're going to realize any potential reparative benefit of this commemorative intervention. This is just one of many examples of reparative remembrance that are happening, examples that are happening in our community right now. There's the Mill Creek Valley Memorial, for example, that's recently been completed. There's the work groups like the Griot Museum are doing with the Black Her Stories initiative. The renovation of the old courthouse to foreground to a greater extent the story of the Freedom Suits and the Freedom Suits Monument. And the list really does go on and on and on. I think I see Trish Gumby over there. Is that right? I don't have my glasses on, and to her credit, she was instrumental in getting people together to talk about things like, marking the landscape so that we move away from this kind of motivated ignorance that's been characteristic of, colorblind racism. Like, let's just act like it doesn't matter. And if we don't talk about it, race will just go away, and structural inequality will go away. The idea is that if we commit to community remembrance, to truth telling, to bearing witness, we can essentially build a foundation of collective understanding, of collective memory, upon which we can build a future where something like social justice is more possible. I think if I had to reduce what these things mean and what reparative remembrance means to one kind of description, I would say it involves paying respect in a context where we have a society that has been organized around disrespect of certain populations defined by race and ethnicity, defined by religion, defined by gender, sexuality. How do we replace this culture of disrespect with one where we pay respect to others who are like us and who are different from us? And that's what I think is really at stake in some of these remembrance efforts. And if we can pay that respect through commemorative interventions, perhaps we can achieve the kind of cultural change, necessary to, one of the initiatives I'm involved in, I'm talking about this the other day, where the WashU Slavery Project, has been, WashU is implicated in the circulation of disrespect, and also, including through things like scientific racism. So how do we, address that, debris? This is the historical debris that the story latched onto. This is in many cases not something, although we have contemporaries, we can think of people today who are engaged in this reiteration of the cultural violence of disrespect, disrespect of women, disrespect of people of color and so forth. But in many respects, this is a structural inheritance we have. This is something, none of us wrote that marker, that county marker, and yet there it was in our community. We inherited it as part of our landscape. So how do we, this is what the point of the debris of history that is piled up all around us. What do we do with it? How do we responsibly dispose of it? But also in the process of doing that, part of what makes it responsible is talking about it and working through it so that we process and integrate within our culture what it means to have removed the debris, why we did it, what values that represents. The Reparative Justice Coalition is a group of volunteers. Some people are here. Could you just raise your hand if you've been involved with the Reparative Justice Coalition at all, come to events or meetings? The Reparative Justice Coalition is a group that organized in St. Louis, sort of in response to the call of Equal Justice Initiative to commemorate the history of lynching and to address its legacy in communities across the country. Equal Justice Initiative, you may know, established this National Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, and while that's a center of remembrance around lynching and its legacy, and they also deal with, issues of mass incarceration and slavery. The idea was to kind of release across the nation, like I love how they described it in one of the articles. They called it like a dandelion, I think is the plant where you blow on it and all the things. They called it to release, the idea was to release spores of memoriam all over the country. And the vision is that if communities work together to grapple with, to acknowledge and to work to deal with the history and legacy of lynching in their community, then those communities will build greater capacity to address other kinds of things like food insecurity or environmental justice or voting rights or whatever the issues are, that you can build, that you can change the political culture that has been affected adversely by the history of lynching and other racialized violence and inequality. You can repair the political culture in a community through this work of remembrance. So we've been doing that. It's been hard too. We've struggled, frankly, to bring a coalition together. And not that people are opposed to this work. It's just, it's hard to get people to commit the time and maintain the energy, particularly with COVID. I mean, everyone was tired of Zoom. I saw that enthusiastic applause for the in-person. It's hard, but we're having a regrouping meeting tomorrow night at the Lewis Center off of Del Mar with Reparative Justice Coalition, Memory for the Future. And Cecilia and I are co-organizing that through Memory for the Future, which I'll just say a little bit about in a moment. And we have, I think a number of you have RSVP'd for that, so I look forward to seeing you if you can make it to that. But we're going to, we've done the soil collection ceremonies for the lynchings of John Buckner and Francis McIntosh, and now we are moving forward with the placement of historical markers and other aspects of the Community Remembrance Project. I'm glad we're getting back on track with that. I should say, Missouri is the only state with a statewide Community Remembrance Project, and is based in Kansas City, but there are 6 or 8 counties across Missouri that are engaged in community remembrance projects. Here in Sikeston and Franklin County and Boone County and several around greater Kansas City and down in Springfield. So, this is encouraging again in our state. Who would have thought it, right? Freedom's Compromise State, but who better than us to really mobilize around this? And I gave an address, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the WashU Slavery Project. I gave a keynote address at our MLK commemoration a couple of weeks ago about the WashU Slavery Project, and the theme of the event that this year was Dr. King's concept of the beloved community. And the beloved community envisions a society organized by mutual understanding and universal goodwill, and where the evil trilogy of militarism and poverty and bigotry is replaced by a socially just society he calls the beloved community. And in my remarks, I was arguing that, I could share them with you. There's also a recording of the speech, but I was arguing, I'm an optimist, you can tell maybe. Somewhere. I was at the History Museum yesterday, and then I was talking about something, and he was like, "Oh, how long you been here?" I was like, "About 6 years now, going on 6 years." He said, "Oh, St. Louis hasn't broken your heart yet." But in the speech, I said, St. Louis has earned the characterization as the broken heart of America, but we might, if we embrace this opportunity to engage in reparative work, we could potentially become the beloved heart of America. It is within our reach. Now, I realize that's a tall order, but there is so much because of what distinguishes us in Walter Johnson's analysis and others, in terms of the legacies, the haunting legacies of colonialism and slavery. Because of that, we have a potential to project not only here locally, but beyond, nationally, regionally, and so forth, this reparative energy. And I really think that's true. I know there are a lot of countervailing winds and currents, or veins, whatever the thing is. But there's a lot of hope. The WashU Slavery Project is briefly is a project in partnership with the Global Consortium of Universities Studying Slavery. This is an organization. This is an effort that started in Virginia. Several universities in Virginia committed to grappling with how their histories, universities' histories, are entangled with the history and legacy of slavery. Committed to examining that and addressing the entanglements. And as of now, there are probably around 100 academic institutions around the world, most of them in the United States, not only in the South, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, where universities are acknowledging these entanglements. Our university, we're about 1.5 years into our project, and not only were many of our founding figures enslavers, but they were also, WashU was founded in 1853, just a few years after Dred and Harriet Scott began their freedom suit in the St. Louis courthouse, within a mile or so of where the original campus was. And just a few years before the infamous Dred Scott ruling in the US Supreme Court that said, again, on this point of disrespect, that said African Americans had no rights that whites are bound to respect, that they are not in fact contemplated as citizens. This is the environment that our university emerges in. One of our founding figures, several of them, were not only enslavers, but deeply involved in the defense of the institution of slavery. John O'Fallon in particular has been of interest to me. He was there was an article, I don't know if you all saw this story, there was an article in the paper recently that said, letter to the editor that said, I guess there's a county in Missouri called Taney County. Yeah, did you all see that? And there was a letter to like St. Louis Post-Dispatch or somewhere that said, Taney County needs to rename itself. And because it's named after the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice who wrote this opinion in the Dred Scott case, this horrible opinion. And I read that, I thought, well, they need to talk about O'Fallon, which is right here, all around us. John O'Fallon was one of the wealthiest men in Missouri in the 19th century, one of the largest slaveholders. He was president of St. Louis's Anti-Abolition Society that was founded in the 1840s to try to stem the tide of abolitionism, which was strong in Missouri. And he, as president, spearheaded a successful campaign lobbying the General Assembly to pass the legislation in 1846 that expressly prohibited the education of African Americans in Missouri. This man was also a founding trustee of WashU and one of our primary benefactors. So our entanglement with slavery and its legacy, WashU, people don't know, I didn't know this until we started doing this work, actually had a few African American graduates in its first several decades. They all graduated from the law school. A law school that begins in a building that is at the same intersection where Francis McIntosh is believed to have been lynched in 7th and Chestnut, downtown St. Louis. That was land that O'Fallon owned, and I could go on about O'Fallon, but WashU graduated several African American students and then stopped admitting any African American students in the 1890s, is implicated in a general sense, is implicated in the institutionalization of racism in St. Louis and beyond, as a global institution to some extent. It is circulating not only through, things like admissions and so forth, but also through, entities like the St. Louis Academy of Science, which is founded in partnership with the Botanical Garden. The Henry Shaw School of Botany is where WashU's biology department begins, and all of its advances in plant sciences begin in this relationship with Henry Shaw, another member of the slaveholding elite in our community. And they also spawn the St. Louis Academy of Science, which is circulating, among other things, pseudoscientific racist claims about how white people are in fact scientifically superior. So we're deeply implicated in the broken heart, as an institution, and other institutions are as well. I don't mean to single out WashU, but it plays a significant role in this community historically. Again, here, the idea is that if we acknowledge this history and we integrate it in our teaching, our research, in the way we engage community, we might position our university as a more credible and ultimately impactful contributor to the pursuit of social justice. So that's part of what it motivates me to lead the WashU Slavery Project, and hopefully to work with other. We are already working with other entities in our community, like the Botanical Garden, who shares our interest in figuring out how to kind of, interpret this history, this difficult truth, how to use it productively as it moves forward. The last thing I want to just mention briefly is the event tomorrow night at Lewis Center is being co-sponsored by Memory for the Future, which is a public humanities lab that I co-lead with Annika Valk, who studies Holocaust memory. She's a historian at WashU who focuses on Holocaust memory. And in that studio lab, we're working with students like Cecilia and others to do two things. One is to reflect on this idea of multi-directional memory. What happens when we look across group experiences, to think about, say, the Holocaust not only as a particular atrocity, but an atrocity that has some things in common with other acts of genocide, other examples of genocidal violence. So the idea of multi-directional memory is that when we engage in it, we move away from competitive memory, where we pit one group's experience against another and compete for who's deserving of the most compassion and so forth. When we do that, we can build long-distance solidarity across difference. That doesn't remove the fact that we have differences, but that gives us a capacity to come together across those differences. That's what Annika and I are interested in as two people working on different histories. I study mostly anti-Black political violence and its legacy. And I mentioned she focuses on the Holocaust. And so one of our partners, our students, we have about 10 students with us in the lab, and they're working with community partners, including the Griot and the Vashon Museum and the Holocaust Museum, and developing different kinds of projects like exhibitions. And you know, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to, if you all want to ask Cecilia to tell you about her exhibition, you can. Working on things like workshops, arts workshops with kids that will be part of Counterpublic 23, and all kinds of creative things that they're doing in the lab. One idea we're working with is multidirectional memory. The other idea we're working with is this idea I started with, which is reparative memory work. And so they're translating that in their projects with community partners. We'll have a showcase of those projects in April, I think it is, right, when we end, at the Lewis Center. And we also have, you have a link to our webpage, and we have Instagram that we always forget to use. But I want to stop there and just thank you again for the invitation. I'm happy to have conversation about any of this if you'd like, or to give the microphone to any of my friends over here. But thank you again for the invitation. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I can speak loudly, but repeat the questions so that people on Zoom can hear them.
Sure.
I wonder if there is a place that you might use as a model who's doing this work well. I read a lot about how the Germans are wrestling their Holocaust history, and there's a lot of memorialization in Berlin, for example. But I wonder where in the United States you think we have a model of this work.
So the question was, is there a place I would point to in the United States that models promising approaches, best practices of what I'm calling reparative remembrance? And Liz mentioned that the people often look to Germany as an example in its Holocaust remembrance. You know, well, I'll say two things. One is there are places that are interesting. I was going to say inspiring, and then my brain wouldn't do it. There are places that are interesting and that seem to have, you know, done more along these lines. Our Memory for the Future group went to Tulsa, Oklahoma for several days to study how that community has been working through the trauma and processing the trauma of the Tulsa massacre and other things as well. Well, while we were there, we were able to visit the Cherokee National History Museum in Cherokee Nation, which had just installed an exhibit on slavery in Cherokee Nation. And so we went to the Jewish Museum of Art, which is also partly a Holocaust museum. And we're interested to see how, like, one of the first exhibits is doing multidirectional memory. It's putting alongside, you know, a representation of a perpetrator of the Tulsa massacre, a representation of the perpetrator of the Nazi regime, and then a representation of a participant in the Charlottesville, you know, the Tiki tortures, and it's drawing a line between them, and you know, it's doing this work of remembrance that, you know, the reason I hesitated to say, so that's the first part. There are definitely places in Montgomery, and we're going with a class this summer to Charleston and the Sea Islands. There's a lot of, you know, energy there around these issues, and we want to study that. I think that, so the sociologist in me says, you know, remind them or tell them what you should have said before, which is that this is all hypothetical. And we don't know for a fact that any of this adds up to much. So I'm not, and I think also the German case has been sort of exaggerated. I mean, there are certainly important aspects of the German case that we should embrace, like, you know, we should not, I think, as a, you know, one voice in this crowd, in our society, we should not indulge the symbology of the Confederacy. And so there are rules like, there are sort of norms and laws like that in places like Germany. But Germany also is witnessing a, you know, a kind of fascist populist movement and you know, anti-immigrant mobilization and so forth. So I think there's also some evidence to suggest that it's not worked entirely, even in this exemplary context. I think we need more data on what, you know, that's the sociologist in me. You know, we need more data on what places are doing and what kinds of differences it makes. It's very hard. You know, I teach a class at WashU called Monumental Anti-Racism, where I work with students to build that database, where we look at examples of anti-racist memory work all around the world and reflect on what they mean and what, you know, what some of the patterns are. And then students also, my favorite part is they come up with their own designs for interventions. Often they turn to the places they're from and they come up with really interesting and important things. And it's all, we have a website about called Monumental Anti-Racism. We need to, you know, we need to be able to assess whether the effect that I talked about before, you know, mitigating the legacy of lynching or enslavement. Do you see that effect in places that engage in community remembrance projects? I mean, this is something I'm working with Molly on, who's a PhD student in sociology. We're starting to study what is the relationship between the disavowal of Confederate memory and the participation in community remembrance projects with EJI. Do they happen? Does that happen in the same places? You know, do people see a connection between them? You know, those kinds of questions. So, so yeah, I don't know. We don't know yet what the impacts are, but I think, and I think that we also see, you know, one of the impacts is backlash. You know, the freak out, the hair on fire, you know, don't make all these laws, you know, the bubble wrap laws, don't make us feel uncomfortable, don't make our kids feel uncomfortable at school, don't expose them to anything, you know, which I interpret as a sign of progress, honestly. I mean, I'm not that crazy. I realize it's a problem, but it's also indicative of the fact that the narrative, they've lost control of this like narrative. The narrative has shifted and it's not going back in the bottle. You know, you actually can't control what people think about. Particularly in the 21st century, there's so much access to information and there are so many people, you know, who historically, women, people of color, who historically were denied, you know, access to the fields of knowledge production and so forth, that circulated critical thought. You can't, you know, they're trying, I know, but you can't actually stop people from thinking critically. So, sorry, that's a long answer about that. It's a great question. And I hope we can learn. I hope we can start to see some evidence. Yeah.
Will the renaming of army bases, taking away the Confederate names, make a difference?
I hope so. Well, I hope it happens. And I know that there was a commission, a naming commission that the military set up, the federal government set up a naming commission to evaluate the names of military installations. And then I saw that they apparently kind of threw their hands up. They released a final report really quickly that seemed to suggest that they'd reached a kind of, that they had decided not to go forward with making a number of recommendations. I'm not sure, except for I think a small subset of bases. But like one example, I actually submitted not surprisingly, they had a portal where you could submit see something, say something portal. I saw something, and so I submitted White Man Air Base. You guys know about this base in Sedalia, Missouri? I know, you're supposed to say it real fast so it's not white man, but it's White Man Air Base, which was renamed, had been Sedalia Airfield or something for many years. You all probably know more about it than me, but I did a little research on this. Again, I was driving to Kansas City, driving through Missouri, you see things. That's why I love that movie about the billboards. You see things, I'm driving to Kansas City, I'm like, White Man Air Base. I got pictures, there's a hotel there that says like, welcome to White Man Hotel at the air base. And, but it was named Sedalia Airfield until like, I believe it was in the the marker, the county marker that went up in 1955, a year after Brown v. Board of Education. St. Louis County is suddenly urgently remembering through the Highway Commission. This was not the State Highway Commission designed these sites. It's suddenly remembering the white colonists. But White Man Air Base is renamed in honor of this man who died in attack on Pearl Harbor, one of the first Missourians to be killed. But it comes way later. And I just thought, well, what's going on? I'm going to stop. I was doing research and I found a newspaper, and you know how you keep like all the wrong things, like there's the things that you didn't keep and then you wish you had. I have all kinds of stuff I actually don't need, like clippings of newspaper. But there was a newspaper article I found when I was researching White Man Air Base that said, it was about a football game where the White Man football team was playing, and it said like, White Man running back, John Smith, Negro, runs for 100 yards. I thought I saved it. It's got to be somewhere. Anyway, I'm sorry. But they didn't respond to my portals.
Any suggestions on how we can attain the goal of collective understanding when curriculum in schools are being questioned and we are not allowing, Florida will not allow an AP Black History course.
Mm-hmm.
Any ideas, suggestions, what researchers can do, what we can do?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. And I was thinking about this when I said I'm encouraged. I didn't mean, there are ominous situations like the attempt to prohibit critical thought and ban books and ban Black study, advanced placement African American studies, which the College Board fast-tracked as its response to this attempt to dismantle structural racism. And again, we see the backlash, right? I think, what we can do, first of all, is advocate, is speak up, not be silent observers to, and particularly, I would say white Americans, saying we demand that this field of study be respected and that our children have access to it. I wish I had access to this myself, if that's how you feel. I'm not trying to tell you what to say, but to be vocal, to engage in the long distance solidarity, the solidarity across differences of race and ethnicity, and to see to really speak to our interdependence publicly is one thing. And a lot of things are happening. Bookstores are putting all the banned books in the window, and they're probably selling more than they did before. And there are things we can do. I think also just not, what the, the protagonists in this drama want us to do is retreat and kind of just surrender and say, okay, well, we tried and we can't do Black studies, I guess. We can't talk about race anymore. And of course, we can't do that. We can't retreat. We can't, but we have to, it's going to be challenging. We had a meeting, there's another of these groups I'm talking about proliferating in our community. One of them is Challenging History, which is a group of mostly museum based folks, National Park Service and others who are organizing to support teachers in K through 12 in their efforts to engage difficult truths and to address the motivated ignorance I was talking about, the not wanting to know, refusing to know. And we had a meeting with recently where I was talking about the fact that Missouri is one of the states that requires Holocaust education. And I said, well, there's a Trojan horse for you. We have to talk about the Holocaust in Missouri schools. It's required. Let's introduce children in that, age appropriate and so forth. There are different kinds of books for different levels, but introduce them to the way that the Holocaust influenced how various groups have understood atrocities that they've, including, the book American Genocide about the genocidal violence perpetrated against Native Americans, or the We Charge Genocide petition that the Civil Rights Congress submitted to the United Nations, drawing on the conventions that come out of the Holocaust. There's a Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee that could be introduced to students. Why is there a Black Holocaust Museum? What are the controversies around it? Why do some members of the community object to this? Why did the organizer of the museum, who was himself a survivor, one of the few people who survived an attempted lynching in Indiana, why did they choose this framing of the museum? That's a really legitimate and worthwhile pedagogical sort of approach to Holocaust education. And I said this in the meeting, and one of the teachers who's part of our group said, which is chilling and relates to your question, the teacher said, looked uncomfortable, and she said, well, I think we would need legislative approval, which is crazy. Like, when do teachers get legislative approval for lesson plans? But well, they don't, but they're vulnerable to the enforcement of these laws. They're vulnerable. What she really meant, I think, is someone might complain and mobilize this law that might jeopardize my livelihood, my career. And it was chilling. Now, I think if these laws, Parents' Bill of Rights and so forth pass, and the last thing I'll say about this question, if these Parents' Bill of Rights laws pass, we should make complaints as parents about the things that we object to. We should flood the courts with, or whatever the administrative body is going to be that's going to adjudicate these claims. Gone with the Wind, problem. US Constitution, problem. Bible, problem. I mean, I think there are things we can do. We just have to advocate. And so, I'll stop. I need like a timer on that.
You covered some of this already without realizing it, but my question was about mindful racism. How do we deal with teaching and understanding the founding father legacy we're all taught, knowing that Washington, definitely, they were all not whom I was taught as a child, who we all have been taught.
Mm-hmm.
There are founding fathers that are in some way untouchable. Some people think they are untouchable in teaching of their stories.
Yeah. It's oh, the question was, sorry, Ellen, the last question, they're probably like, what is he talking about? The previous question was, what do we do about these attempts to ban things like advanced placement, Black studies, and so forth in our schools? And this question was about the sort of sacred stories about our founding figures that are so deeply implanted in our culture. What do we do with those? How do we take on other ideas about them? I think is that just the question. And the question included mention of people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all of them. I think, one of the reasons, so I think a lot of what we're talking about right now is doing that work, but it's not reaching everyone. Like the work in schools, reaches school age children or people who attend colleges and universities for the most part. So to me, one of the challenges there, and this was part of the logic of the WashU Slavery Project, by the way, which was what the chancellor asked faculty who do work on these things, what more should we be doing? And I said we should join this initiative in part because it will allow us to reach more of our students, our staff, and our faculty as these questions are concerned than is typically the case. Typically at a college or university, you're only going to think about slavery and its legacy if you take the class on that, and that's a real small fraction. I mean, that doesn't reach the medical school, doesn't reach most of the people in the sciences and so forth. So how do we build this into the fabric of the institution such that there are more touch points with these kinds of questions? And that was part of my argument for joining this consortium, to make our whole university more likely to grapple with these ways of understanding structural racism and so forth. But another part of that I think speaks to, addresses your question is I've gotten involved recently. I mean, things like historical markers and public history are one reason I've gotten more involved in those things is because those are examples of ways to reach a broader community, people who aren't in school or who finished school long ago and aren't going back. They're not going to retake American history, but they can encounter a reinterpretation of Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, or, I've been pushing the city of Clayton on these utility boxes that have the slavers, Hanley and Clayton emblazoned on them. And maybe we keep them on there, but we add some interpretive material that, people would encounter. I've been interested in exhibition curation for this reason. People do go to museums, and museums happen to be one of the most trusted institutions in our deeply fragmented and distrustful culture right now. People don't trust the government, don't trust the courts, don't trust media. They have more open minds in spaces like museums. So maybe that's a place where we can meet people with challenging ideas. So I think of those sorts of things. I mean, we're never gonna, nor do we want to invent like a pill or something, memory replacement thing, but we can provide opportunities to encounter the counter narratives that have been, the truth in many respects that has been so dutifully, withheld. I mean, people, groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy were really smart in determining, I mean, evil, pernicious, but smart in thinking we should take control of the production of history textbooks. And they did. They ensured that the Confederacy would be whitewashed in the books that children were reading. So I think we have to, it's hard, and there's still that campaign, right? We're seeing it now. but there are things we can do, like supporting film projects and going to them and helping circulate them, and going to museums that when going to the exhibit on this or that thing that is engaging in a difficult past, I think is part of it.
Okay, some questions from Zoom. So Lacey asks, what is the status of financial reparations for descendants of slavery? Is this one way to address the economic inequities that are the legacy of slavery?
I think, I don't know what the status is. I know maybe that,
Can you repeat? Sorry.
what is the status of financial reparations for descendants of slavery? And do financial reparations promise to repair the harm, essentially, right? Is that right? Are they talking about St. Louis or you don't know? Well, one of the answers to that is that it's all over the map in terms of U.S. Reparations discussions. They are, I think, unfortunately, there is no federal or national. There is a bill that has been brought before Congress consistently, but it is not passed. And so in the meantime, you have cities like ours, city of St. Louis most recently, but others as well, who've embarked on reparations initiatives. Our initiative, as I understand it, is just getting underway with a commission in St. Louis that's going to begin investigating the harm and what the implications are for repair. This is a really big question, so I just want to, you've seen I can just not stop talking about things. So let me just say, in terms of the second part of the question, do I think this will be effective in remediating the harm? I don't think financial reparations alone would be sufficient. And I don't, I think there are, just say like two problems. One is, who are the descendants? I talked about structural inheritance. We have been collectively harmed by the institution of slavery and its legacy. It's corrupted our political culture. It has corrupted our institutions. It has left damages that manifest in the form of infrastructure, some of which, all of which affects not only the genealogical descendants of formerly enslaved people, but also new immigrant populations who settle in community, in these zones of historical abandonment, and who are now exposed to things like contaminated water and lead paint that are the debris I was talking about, the historical debris. Financial reparations to genealogical descendants don't wade into that complicated water. What do we do with the fact that in Missouri, in St. Louis, a large proportion of the African-American population is descendant from migrants from the lower Mississippi Valley, from the Mississippi Delta region. So who are the direct descendants we would recognize in St. Louis? Now, I'm a descendant on my biological family side through my father, who was African-American from South Carolina, where the largest share of enslaved Africans arrived in this country. I'm a descendant on my adoptive mother's side, African-American woman from Wilmington, North Carolina, a family that was targeted in the 1898 racial massacre and coup in Wilmington. I'm also biologically related to a Scots-Irish woman from California who's implicated in another part of the history. What does that add up to in terms of the question of genealogical descent? My point is not, I'm afraid I'm not going to get my share. It's like, how do we make sense of the shares? The other concern I have, I'm going to say two things, and I don't know if this is true or not, but the other concern I have, and this relates to, and let me be clear, I'm in favor of reparative, clearly, right? Reparative strategies that would include, political and economic kinds of responses. But I think for reparations to be truly transformative, which should be its agenda, its agenda should be to transform the society in a way. One of the principles of reparations is ensuring non-repetition. So how do we pursue reparations in a way that is most likely to ensure the non-repetition of systematic racialized violence and exploitation and exclusion and so forth? I don't think financial reparations really contemplate that enough. And I'm afraid that we don't have the patience as a society to kind of work through the complicated questions around what kind of approach to reparations would be truly transformative. And we're instead going to see things like we've seen in places like, Evanston, Illinois, where there was a payment to people who were affected by housing discrimination, which is important. But it's not going to, I think it was like, I don't know what the amount, does anyone remember? It was like, $6,000 or something. That is not going to transform our culture. It's not going to really transform the conditions of people's lives. It is going to let municipalities say, we did reparations. Let's move on. So that's my concern about it. Those are my long 2 points.
Okay, Ellen says, or asks, how can we find out more about the group working to commemorate or educate about the history and sites of the individuals who were lynched in Missouri, either to understand more of what's being discovered or to participate in this group's effort?
So the question was, how can we learn more about the Reparative Justice Coalition, the group working to commemorate lynching and address its legacy? The best thing to do would be to go to our website, which is at RJC-STL.org, right? And there's a lot there about the two cases we've been focused on so far: the lynching of Frances McIntosh in what is now the area of Keener Plaza, and the lynching of John Buckner in St. Louis County in the, what's the name of the town? Valley Park. So we have more about those lynchings, and there will be, hopefully we're getting back on track, and we'll begin to meet regularly again, and people can become involved as much as they're inclined or can attend what I hope will be an unveiling of historical markers before long. And we're also going to do things like we're planning to hold an essay contest where we engage students. This is part of EJI's model of reparative community remembrance projects. You have essay contests, cash prizes for student essays that talk about the issues and why they're important for us to think about today. And we're working with the Griot Museum on an exhibition of the jars of soil that were collected in remembrance of the McIntosh and Buckner lynching. So at some point, that will also be a place where you can learn more about the work of the coalition.
Okay, a question from Merit. She talks about the pushback that happens when people perceive concept like reparative remembrance as being intended to cause shame. And she says she believes shame is immobilizing, not helpful in creating change. What place do shame and guilt have in this conversation, in your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think.
Summarize that.
The question was, what role do shame and guilt have in this reparative work? So often it feels like reparative justice kinds of agendas are focused on making people feel shame is that, and there's a concern that that's not a productive avenue. It's demobilizing. And what are my thoughts on that? I think that it's true that people react negatively to the feeling of shame and feel assaulted by it. My pseudo-scientific feeling about it is this is not something I study. I wish I knew more about the psychological evidence on shame. I saw Molly over here nodding. Molly is also a therapist. And maybe you could work us through this some, but my thought is that shame is a complex feeling, and it is not, I shouldn't be reduced to an immobilizing feeling. It is something we can work through in a process of committing to change. And, you know, I feel shame. I don't feel responsible for, I feel ashamed of some of the things that our nation has done, you know, and, you know, I become implicated in those things as a person who identifies as an American. And you know, I think, you know, it's interesting with shame, you know, it's interesting, we use shame all the time in our culture as a strategy of socialization, of norm socialization. You know, we use shame to teach young people, for example, when they're in violation of norms, and to encourage obedience to social norms. We use it with peers, you know, with the glances we give when someone's being a ridiculous human being, or, you know, and there's a version of shame that is, you know, hostile and, you know, exceedingly aggressive and irrational even. But we use shame to communicate what it is we value. And I think there's something productive about that. If people can again have the patience, the willingness to work through that feeling. Like, why am I feeling this way about the conversation around slavery? Why am I feeling this way even though I myself have not enslaved anyone? What is that about? I think if we can sit with that feeling a bit more and not so desperately work to reject it and not feel uncomfortable, then we can move to another place of understanding where we can more productively work towards the kinds of changes we want to see in our society. I mean, this was what they never consulted with me about it, but what I think the county executive and his folks decided was, we don't want to make people uncomfortable by this discussion of the county marker. We don't want to make people feel bad. So the best thing to do is just remove it when no one's looking and not talk about it. But that reifies that reconditions people to not be able to deal with discomfort. So I don't think there's an easy way around the kind of, the dealing with difficult truths and the emotions that it involves. I do think that it's important to be sensitive to the way that people experience, these issues, the historical trauma and across the board, but I don't think we can not deal with it because it makes us uncomfortable.
One of the things Mary knows, the Confederacy monuments inside Arlington Cemetery. Arlington Cemetery, and on that very large monument, there is a mammy with a little baby for the Confederacy soldier to go off to war. It's honored inside our Arlington Cemetery. most outlandish, unbelievable, of all the things you know. That if you could wave a magic wand, you could get rid of that.
Oh, well, let's see. My first thought was white man air base, but when you really put the question all together, I mean, the one that, oh, what is the most outlandish example of like white supremacist commemorative endeavor, object, that I've come across in my surveys of the landscape? And I think it has to be Stone Mountain in Georgia, probably. Not only because of what the Stone Mountain, depicts, but because of its history in relation to the mobilization of the Ku Klux Klan as a gathering place. I think I think it's, it's the same artist who made Mount Rushmore, and that probably is in the running too, Mount Rushmore. But I think Stone Mountain would be the one, partly because of its scale, but mostly because of its direct connection to white racial terror. So if I could wave a magic wand, yeah, it would be, I have to be careful too. I realize you got like, how many people on here? They're gonna be like, he was saying he was gonna blow up Stone Mountain, didn't say that. But no, I think it is just, talk about historical debris. I don't know if any of you have been to Stone Mountain or, have a sense of its scale. It is massive. Yeah, Robert E. Lee. And, think about Stone Mountain and think about the mounds. These mounds that are sacred. We're sacred to Native peoples, that very few of which remain here, many of which were here in St. Louis. And there's one in the Sugarloaf Mound is on Jefferson, is one of the sites that Counterpublic 23 will activate in April. And now Sugarloaf Mound, this might be on the list too. Sugarloaf Mound, someone built a house on top of Sugarloaf Mound. Little house like right on top of this small mound, talk about, this is the disrespect I'm talking about. This is the performativity of dominance is to put a house on top of this mound that everyone knows is not just a random sort of hill. The performativity of Stone Mountain. So that would be my sorry.
So I know you're talking about restorative justice, but I'm wondering if you know anything about what's going around the new geospatial center in North St. Louis and how people are losing their homes and it's being gentrified and they don't know what to do.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that situation. I don't know a lot about what is happening right now. In relation to this question of restorative justice, what about what's happening with the National Geospatial site and the displacement of neighborhoods and the gentrification that's happening right now in this part of our community? And I was just saying that I don't know a lot about what's happening right now and how people are mobilizing in response to it. I do know that I spent a lot of time at the Griot and the Vashon museums, and one thing that intrigues me about that area is the important Black cultural institutions that exist around the perimeter of the National Geospatial Institute, you know, Scott Joplin House to the west, the Griot and Vachon to the north, other sites to the south. And I feel like one of the things that surprised me when I got to St. Louis and I learned about the geospatial thing, and I learned also about the Great Rivers Greenway, which I thought was just, you know, really exciting in general, this idea of building greenways that help to address the historical debris of our fragmented city, of our unequal divided city. And I was surprised that the development of the geospatial institution did not involve some kind of at least compromise that would include an investment in the Black cultural institutions, you know, the Black arts and heritage corridor that effectively is there. I mean, there are other museums, vernacular museums, other sites. It seemed to me a missed opportunity, and maybe it's not too late to say, you know, if we're going to pursue a project like this that undermines community in this way, there have to be investments that build community in another way. And one of those to me would be, what struck me would be investment in the, you know, the Black arts and culture kind of corridor that's been there, but struggling, you know, depending upon donations and visitors paying entry fees, that is carved out of the Zoo Museum tax district that the city and county fund through our taxes, that contributes to our wonderful, you know, art museum and history museum and zoo and so forth. So I think, you know, unfortunately, there's no going back on that geospatial space. And you see people mobilizing around it, like, well, how do we graft onto it, you know, STEM projects that address issues of equity, representation in the fields. But I think it's not, I think this will be an ongoing kind of question. If we're going to commit to this kind of development that involves some kind of displacement, what is the reparative counterweight that will come with it? And I haven't, I really don't know what the answer to, if that question has been asked and what the answer has been. But I think it's not, you know, you've got the Homer G. Tiny Hospital. I mean, it's not over, you know, the conversation is not over. And I hope, again, that just I'll end on this point of encouraging and thanking you for your advocacy. You know, you're all here on a Thursday night. You raise your voices for social justice. I mean, I think we have to keep advocating around these kinds of questions. And if we do so, I think we can continue to advance a reparative agenda in our community and in the larger world. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. And we welcome you to our next program next week at the Kirkwood Library. And thanks again to Dr. Ward and his associates for giving a very fascinating and important talk to all of us. I really appreciate it.